So one of my followers over on Patreon asked me if I would make a video explaining how I sew my Modesty panels. Sewing the Modesty panel is actually probably the easiest part of making a corset because it's really just like a simple rectangle with some boning in it for support. And if you don't know what a Modesty panel is, it's just the part that goes behind your corset like that, and it just provides a little bit extra coverage at the opening if you want to have your corset laced open, or if you just want to create like a more historical look, like a stomacher would usually typically be there on like a set of stays or something. And the Modesty panel is totally optional for corsets, but it's sometimes fun if you even just make it like in a different color or something, or, you know, what they would do historically is they would put like really intricate embroidery on it and stuff. And I'm not going to go that far today, but I just thought I would show you how to make this because it's really, really simple. So the only thing you're going to need to make your corset is obviously the fabric that you want to use for the Modesty panel. I use the same lining fabric that I would for the corset, which is like a cotton canvas, but you don't have to use cotton canvas. You could just use like a pretty lining fabric if you wanted to, or you could use the same fabric as the outside of the corset, but I feel like having the cotton canvas does make it a little bit stiffer, which is nice because the Modesty panel is supposed to have a bit of stiffness to it, and you do want it to sort of mimic the same look as the corset anyway. So if you don't have the fabric, it's not a big deal to use something else, but it's preferred to kind of keep it the same as your corset fabric. So the other thing you'll need to make this besides the fabric is boning, specifically rideline boning. So this boning usually gets a pretty bad rap because it's kind of what you would find in like a really cheaply made evening gown or prom dress or something. It's the one that people always complain about that like pokes into their sides or gets disfigured and bent out of shape. And you can see that, like, yeah, this does bend really easily. It's not like as good as a type of boning that you would use for a corset, like synthetic whalebone or like steel boning or something. But it is really great for use as a stiffener for other things. Like you can see on this box, they use it for hats and little bags and stuffed animals and whatnot. You can find it at most fabric stores. I think, you know, Joann sells it, and probably Michael's or wherever you get your fabric. And I would recommend getting the 1/2 inch wide one for the Modesty panel. This one's a 1/4 inch, but the 1/2 inch will do the job a lot better. And the thing that I like the most about this boning is that you can sew it in to the fabric itself. You don't have to create boning channels. So don't know if you can see that, my stitch lines. And if you look at the rideline itself, there's this little edge here where you can sew through it and it'll attach itself to the fabric. And this is just a lot easier than creating boning channels, especially for something as simple as a rectangle. The boning channels are more necessary for, you know, a corset because you're trying to use a proper boning. But really, if you're just like in a pinch and you need to stiffen something really quickly, then this stuff is great. So to determine the measurements that you need for your Modesty panel, you typically just need to measure the amount that you want to provide coverage for. So, you know, let's say that when you have your corset on, you have it kind of laced open like that. So if you just measure that gap, right here I have a 4-inch gap, and I would probably want to add 1 inch to either side to cover that distance and give me a little wiggle room. And then when you're measuring the length, you need to measure, I'd give myself like about a 1/2 inch lower than the edge of the neckline. And then how long you want to make it kind of depends on the shape you're going to do. If you're going to do a traditional rectangular shape like this, then you can't really make it go all the way to the bottom. Otherwise, if you have it closed like that, then it's going to poke out at the sides, and that doesn't look good. So the alternative would be to make more of a V-shape Modesty panel like this, and you could do that after practicing this for a few times. It's really not that much harder. You just kind of have to put the boning differently. But for my corsets, I usually just make them a rectangle and it works out fine, especially if you have it closed at the waist and you're wearing a skirt or something, then it kind of ends right where the waist is and you don't really need to cover this little gap here. So for measuring the length, you can see that on this one, I have it stop kind of just like right where the waistline is, so that even when it's fully closed, it's not gonna poke out at all. So to take your measurements, I would just kind of measure the width of your Modesty panel. So mine is 5 inches, and so I'm going to split that in half, 2.5 inches, and just measure down like that to where the bottom would be. And then if you have a ruler like this, that's really helpful, because then you can just go measure 2.5 this way. I have it about a 1/2 inch lower than my neckline, and then I'm going to take it, I want it to be about a 1/2 inch above where my waistline is. So you can see that if it was 5 inches, then it would hit about here-ish. And that's a little bit close to the edge for me, so I might just take it up to here. So I would do 6 inches for mine. And so with that, it would be 6 inches wide by 6 inches long. And I'm going to show you what to do with that next. You don't even really need to make a pattern for this because it's just a rectangle. So I'm just going to grab a fabric marker and my ruler, and I'm just going to draw it right on the lining. So I like to use the straight edge if I have it, but you know, work with your fabric, which you've got. And I'm just going to make sure that this is a squared off edge. So let's say that the finished measurements you want to be 6 by 6, then you need to add some room for your seam allowance. So I usually like to add a 1/2 inch around all sides. So that would be, you know, 1 inch on each measurement. So if I want my Modesty panel to be 6 by 6, then the measurements that I would cut would be 7 by 7. So I'm actually making a Modesty panel for a client today, so I'm not going to be using those measurements that I measured for the corset, but the measurements that I want to have when finished are 7 by 5, so that means that I'm going to cut my Modesty panel to be 8 by 6. So I just have here, I'm going to mark 6 right there, and then just to make sure that everything is nice and square, I just kind of like arbitrarily mark where, that's not 6. That's 6. Okay. I just mark where 6 inches is along here. If you have one of those T-square rulers, this is a helpful time to use that as well. And now I'm going to measure my length, which is 8 inches. So now we just connect these, and I've got an 8 by 6 inch square. So I'm just going to cut this out, and then we're going to do almost the same thing with the outer fabric, but with just a little bit extra added, and I'll show you how to do that as well. Alright, so for my outer fabric, I'm going to do the same thing. Just find a nice little scrap to work with. And this part is easy, you don't even really need to measure it. I'm just gonna, you know, you could just place it on top, or if you have a fold to work with, I'm just gonna put it on the fold here. And just put it like that, line it up. And you can pin that in place. And then the last thing I like to do is I like to make this piece of fabric just a tiny bit bigger than the other piece, so that it has enough fabric to make this like little turn of cloth fabric edge here. So we're just going to add like a tiny bit extra so that it has enough to do that. Otherwise it gets kind of like tight, and then you can see the lining fabric from the other side, and I don't like that. So we're just going to add about 1/8 of an inch to either side when we cut this. So just the tiniest amount. I probably should have added 1/8 of an inch there as well, but that's okay. So now that that's done, we need to measure our rideline pieces. And it might be helpful for you for the first time that you're making this to just kind of mark out where your seam allowance is. So I added a 1/2 inch to all my pieces. So the next thing we need to do is cut the length of our rideline. And one important thing to remember is that you're not going to be sewing your rideline into the seam allowance because then it won't fold properly. So we only want to cut the rideline to go inside of the seam allowance here. And you can see here that I have 5 pieces, so 1 here, here, and here, and then 2 on the side. And I want to get this middle line marked too, so I'm just going to fold my piece in half here. Increase that. And then I can mark that. So just take your rideline and some craft scissors. Don't use your fabric scissors to cut this. And I'm just going to put it up to the edge here. You might not want to put it quite up to the edge because then it could sort of poke through the fabric. So I do like about 1/8 of an inch less on either side. So I'm just going to cut it right there. And then these are all going to be the same length. So you could just essentially cut 3 pieces of this. So I just go like that. And then we just need the pieces to go lengthwise here. So same thing, I'm going to give myself about 1/8 of an inch on the top and the bottom. And then you need 2 of this same length, so I'm just going to measure that like that and cut it. If your rideline pieces are really curved, like if you are down at the end of your roll or the craft store you got it from the end of the roll instead of sort of the outside, then you might find that these are a little bit too curved to deal with and it's a little bit difficult. So if that's the case, you can just put these under the iron and steam them out and then they'll relax. And in fact, I'm probably going to do that with mine just so I can show you a little bit easier. But with all these pieces ready, you're ready to go and you can start sewing. So the first thing you're going to do before you start sewing the boning is you're just going to sew these 2 pieces together. So I have right sides together and I'm just going to sew right where my seam allowance is. And because this black piece is a little bit longer than the other piece, I'm just going to make sure that I have it sort of in between the 2 spots there. So now that I have that, I can put my rideline on the piece, and remember, I'm just kind of giving it a little bit of an edge away from the actual seam allowance. And then I'm going to align this one on top here as well. And I do kind of have a sequence for how I sew these pieces on that might not really make sense at first, but I go around this way so that I don't have to lift up the thread and do back stitching and cut it. I just do it all in one stitch. So try to follow along with me. If it doesn't make sense to you, then just sew the pieces on however makes sense. But this is kind of how I do it so that it's the fastest and the easiest, or the laziest, I should say. So I'm just going to start up at the corner here and sew this piece down. And then when you get to this edge, add this piece in, and this is the very middle, so make sure that you're kind of aligning your rideline over the center of that. And make sure that this edge gets caught in the stitching when you're stitching right down through here. And keep going down and add your last row of rideline. Next I'm going to add this last piece. And since I have this longer piece on the bottom on the other side, I'm going to try to put it on the bottom on this side as well. So when I get here, I'm just going to backstitch and then start sewing down this way. And then backstitch. Another thing worth pointing out is that if your thread is having a hard time going through this, then you might need to change your needle size to a bigger needle. I usually like to use a 14 if I'm sewing through some pretty thick fabrics. I think right now this might be a 12, and I feel like sometimes the 12 works if it's a fresh needle, but if I just keep having problems with it, then I would switch it to a size 14, and then it should have no problem going through the rideline. But because it's a thicker fabric, you do need something a little bit thicker to be able to penetrate that. And that's it. So you can see that I did the whole thing without having to take anything up off of the machine. And it looks just like that. So that's the hardest part. Now I just need to sew my seam allowances on. So I'm going to do this long vertical side first. Having that little gap away from the seam allowance there also makes it easier to sew the seam because the rideline kind of tends to get in the way. So when that part is done, my little trick to create a clean edge is you're going to fold your seam allowance in like that. Okay? And then you're going to, when you stitch this down, you're going to stitch that seam allowance down in as well. So like this. And then when you go to flip it, fold this corner down as well and kind of poke it through. Like that. And that is how you create the cleanest corner possible when you turn your fabric. So you can see that made like a really, really nice corner there. I didn't even have to use my point turner at all. and that's because of the way that I stitched down the seam allowance. So don't forget that part. And now you can already see that extra little fabric that we added to the edges. That's called turn of cloth. So it just makes a really, really nice looking modesty panel from both sides. So you don't see any of that white edge on this side because of that. And now we just have one last edge on the bottom here. So what I would do here is just kind of try to tuck this in like so. I'm keeping, again, I want to push all the seam allowance in towards the lining, not towards the outside, so that when I fold this, it makes that nice clean corner right there. So do the same to both sides. Fold the seam allowance in towards the lining, fold it, and then just sort of tuck in the seam allowance as best you can. And then ironing this down before you sew it will kind of help keep that in place. So I'm going to go do that real quick. So I already have that iron. It's not even sewn down, but you can see that it just looks really clean and nice. So at this point, it's up to you. You could technically hand sew this shut if you wanted to have a really, really nice seamless finish, but it's just a modesty panel. It's not really going to be seen. So for me, I don't mind just machine sewing it down. And you kind of have a little bit of an issue here because you have two different color fabrics, very different contrast. So when I sew this down, I want my bobbin thread to be white so that it looks white on this side, and then I want it to be black on this side. So I'm just going to change my top thread to be black. And then when you stitch this down, just remember that you do have sort of like that 1/8 of an inch lip of fabric there. So kind of try to sew this around 1/4 of an inch to make sure you catch everything. And when it's done, it looks like that. So just give this another quick ironing and then it'll look really, really clean and finished. And that's it. That's all there is to it. I did get one other question in regards to the modesty panel is how do you attach it into a corset if you want it to be permanently in there? And there are two different ways that you could go about it. So the simplest way to go about it is you could just simply put this inside of your corset where you want it to be and just hand stitch it in. That is a great solution if you kind of want it to be removable, or if you forgot to attach it when you were making the corset, or if you're making a new one for a corset that is already made. And the second way to do it is if you're in the process of making the corset and you know that you want the modesty panel to be permanently sewn in. So for example, I do this on my Regency stays or anything with back lacing where I know that I'm always going to want the modesty panel to be inside, and there's never any reason that I would want to take it out. So you can see on this one that it's stitched to the inside there, but there's no stitching on the outside here. That is a boning channel, but the actual modesty panel itself is not attached at all. So just attached to the lining. And the secret to doing that, it's not really a secret. You just sew it to the lining before you make the rest of the corset. So when you're working on this piece of your lining, you would just sew this edge into the lining, and it's just top stitched there. It's nothing fancy. And the one thing that you're doing different when you're constructing the modesty panel is I don't put any boning or rideline on this side so that it's easier to sew through it. So you can see there's no rideline there, and that's what allows me to sew through this without having any issues. And the rest of the modesty panel provides enough structure so that you don't need rideline on that side to still create this nice shape. So if you're doing a free-floating Modesty panel, put rideline on both sides of your vertical side, and if you're doing a sew-in one, then only put it on one side. And then, as I said before, you would just top stitch it into your lining. Make sure to give yourself enough room for your grommets and any boning that you might have. It can be a little tricky to fit it all in there if you have a lot of boning, but just kind of measure it a few times before you stitch it down. And do give yourself enough space to put in the binding as well, because if you make it a little bit too long, then it starts to get really tricky to add the binding once you're at that point. Other than that, the steps for creating the Modesty panel are essentially the same. So I hope that you found this tutorial useful, and if you tried it, I would love to know. If you found it easy, if my instructions were clear, let me know. And thanks again to Michaela, who was the patron that suggested I make this tutorial. And if there's anything else you would like to see regarding Modesty panels or corset construction techniques, let me know and I'll add them to my list. Until next time, happy sewing!